Stop composting, seriously. If your garden depends on a separate pile that needs turning, watering, balancing, monitoring, and waiting, you might be solving the wrong problem. For years, I believed composting was the foundation of a healthy garden. I built bins, I monitored temperatures, I turned piles like it was a weekly ritual, I measured carbon and nitrogen ratios. I read the books, I followed the rules, and I was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. Because composting becomes another system to manage, another thing that can fail, another box to check before you're allowed to feed your soil. But here's the question I eventually had to ask myself. If forests don't compost in piles, why am I? Walk into any woodland. You won't see tidy bins in the corner. You won't see someone flipping leaves with a fork. You won't see thermometers stuck into decomposing matter. You'll see layers. Leaves fall, branches drop, plants die back. Everything lands exactly where it grew. And it stays there. That's not neglect. That's a system. In a forest, nutrients don't take a detour through a management station. They return directly to the soil. Decomposition happens in place. Fungi connect everything underground. Worms move material down. Moisture regulates the process naturally. No one intervenes. And yet forests build deeper, richer soil every single year. So, I started wondering if composting piles were less about soil health and more about our need to feel productive. Because turning a pile feels like work. Measuring temperatures feels responsible. Watching steam rise feels like progress. But is it necessary? The more I studied natural systems, the more I realized something uncomfortable. Composting piles are often a workaround for a problem we created. Bare soil. When soil is exposed, it dries out. Microbes die back. Organic matter breaks down too quickly. Nutrients wash away, so we collect scraps, process them somewhere else, and then reapply them to repair what exposure damaged in the first place. But what if the soil was never bare? What if organic matter never left the surface? What if decomposition happened exactly where plants needed it? That's when I stopped asking, how do I make better compost? And started asking, why am I moving nutrients away from where they're needed? Because every time you carry kitchen scraps across your yard to a bin, you're creating labor. Every time you turn a pile, you're inserting yourself into a process that microbes already understand. And every time you wait 6 months for finished compost, you're delaying fertility that could have been feeding your soil immediately. This doesn't mean composting is wrong. It means it might not be the lowest input way. On low input living, the goal isn't to work harder for better soil. It's to build systems where nature does most of the work. So instead of building compost piles, I started feeding the soil directly. No bins, no turning. No thermometers, no waiting. And the results surprised me. Not just in plant growth, but in time. Because when you remove an entire management system from your garden, you free up energy. And energy is often the most limited resource on any homestead. What replaced my compost pile wasn't complicated, it was embarrassingly simple. I stopped moving organic matter away from the soil and started putting it directly on or into it. That's it. Instead of hauling kitchen scraps to a bin across the yard, I began burying them where I was already growing food. Not deep trenches, not elaborate systems, just small pockets between plants. A quick dig, scraps in, soil back over the top. No turning, no balancing ratios, no waiting for a finished product. The soil life handled the rest. At first it felt wrong. Years of gardening culture had trained me to believe raw scraps would attract pests, create smells, or somehow burn the soil. But when scraps are buried properly and covered, decomposition begins immediately underground. Worms find it, microbes colonize it, moisture stays regulated because it's below the surface, and nothing sits exposed long enough to become a problem. Then I took it further. Instead of clearing beds at the end of a season and dragging plants to a compost pile, I cut them at the base and left the roots in the ground. The tops were chopped and dropped right there on the surface as mulch. That single shift changed everything. Roots decompose in place, creating channels for air and water. Soil organisms feed without interruption. Carbon stays where it belongs. And I'm not hauling wheelbarrows across the property trying to process material that nature already knows how to process. Think about the energy savings. No building bins, no turning piles every few days, no monitoring moisture, no shoveling finished compost back onto beds, just direct return. This is sometimes called trench composting or in-place composting. But I don't think of it as a technique. I think of it as removing a middle step, because that's what compost piles are, a middle step. Organic matter, compost pile, finished compost, garden bed. Why not simplify it? Organic matter, garden bed. The deeper realization came when I paid attention to moisture. Compost piles require active management because they're exposed. They dry out, they get too wet. They need aeration, they need balance. But organic matter that's buried or covered with mulch stays in a stable environment. It doesn't swing between extremes. Soil temperature buffers it. Fungi move through it naturally. Decomposition becomes steady instead of dramatic, and steady systems require less input. There's also a time shift that most people don't notice. With a compost pile, fertility is delayed. You wait months to apply it. With in-place decomposition, fertility begins exactly where the plant roots already are. There's no transport delay, nutrients cycle locally. It's not about speed, it's about proximity. Now, does this mean I never compost in a pile? Very rarely. If I have excess material far from growing areas, sometimes I'll stack it loosely and let it break down passively. But I don't manage it. I don't treat it like a project. Because projects require attention, systems require design. And low input living is about designing systems that reduce attention over time. The first season I made this shift, I expected some kind of disaster. I thought plants might struggle. I thought yields might drop. Instead, something subtle happened. The soil stayed covered longer. It stayed darker. It held moisture better. And I spent less time working on fertility. But there's one concern most people raise immediately. What about pests? Let's talk about the fear. Because the moment you tell someone you bury kitchen scraps directly in the garden, the first reaction is almost always the same. What about pests? It's a fair question. We've all seen what happens when food is left exposed. Flies show up, rodents investigate. Things start to smell, but here's what I learned the hard way. Pests are attracted to access, not decomposition. When organic matter is left on the surface, uncovered or concentrated in one unmanaged location, it becomes an invitation. A compost pile sitting above ground is easy to locate. It's centralized, it's predictable, but buried scraps are different. When you dig a small hole 8 to 10 inches deep, drop in your scraps and cover them fully with soil. There's no scent trail drifting through the air. There's no exposed material broadcasting its presence. Underground decomposition begins quietly. Soil is a filter. It contains smell, it regulates moisture. It creates a stable environment where microbes go to work immediately. And because the scraps are dispersed throughout your growing space rather than concentrated in a single bin, there's no buffet line forming in one location. I also noticed something else. When I stopped piling organic matter in one area, rodent pressure actually decreased. Before, my compost bin was a predictable feeding station. Even when managed well, it was a place where something edible always existed. Once I eliminated that hotspot, there was nothing centralized to attract repeat visitors. Now, could burying scraps incorrectly cause problems? Of course. If you leave material partially exposed, if you dig too shallow, or if you dump large volumes in one place, you're creating imbalance. Low input living isn't about being careless. It's about being intentional in simpler ways. Small amounts, spread out, properly covered, that's it. Another concern people raise is nitrogen burn or nutrient imbalance. The assumption is that raw scraps are too hot for plants. But this fear usually comes from applying undecomposed material directly against stems or roots without soil buffering it. When scraps are buried between plants, not directly on top of root systems, microbes process them gradually. Nutrients are released over time. It becomes a slow feed rather than a shock. And that slow release mirrors what happens in natural systems. In a forest, a fallen apple doesn't turn into finished compost first. It decomposes where it lands. Fungi, bacteria, insects, and worms break it down step by step. Nutrients enter the soil web locally. Nothing explodes, nothing burns. It's steady. What really changed my perspective wasn't just the absence of problems. It was observing how soil responded long term. Areas where I buried scraps regularly became darker and looser. Earthworm activity increased. The soil structure improved without tilling. When I pulled back mulch months later, I rarely found recognizable food. It had already integrated. And here's something important. This method forces you to think differently about waste. Instead of viewing scraps as something that must be processed before they're useful, you begin to see them as immediate inputs. That mental shift matters, because once you start returning everything directly to the soil, you naturally begin reducing export. Leaves stay where they fall. Plant roots stay in the ground. Trimmings become surface cover. You're not managing fertility as a separate task. You're designing your space so fertility never leaves. And when fertility never leaves, labor decreases. Here's where the real shift happened. When I stopped composting in piles and started feeding the soil directly, I thought I was just saving time. What I didn't expect was how much more resilient the soil became. Because fertility isn't just about nutrients, it's about structure. When organic matter decomposes in place, both buried below and layered on top, it feeds more than plants. It feeds fungi, it feeds bacteria, it feeds earthworms. And those organisms don't just release nutrients. They build architecture fungal networks stretched through the soil like living threads. They bind particles together, they create pathways for water, they transport nutrients beyond the reach of roots. When you constantly disturb soil to mix in finished compost, you interrupt those networks. But when decomposition happens where plants are already growing, disturbance decreases. And with less disturbance, structure improves. I began noticing that after heavy rains, my beds didn't crust over the way they used to. Water soaked in instead of running off. During dry spells, the soil stayed moist longer under a layer of chopped plant residue. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. But season after season it compounded. The surface remained covered almost all year. That alone changes everything. Bare soil is vulnerable. Sun bakes it, wind dries it, rain compacts it. But soil covered with organic matter acts like a sponge. It absorbs. It buffers. It protects the life underneath. When I used compost piles, there were times beds would sit exposed while I waited for material to finish. Now nothing waits. Every trimming becomes mulch. Every spent plant becomes protection. Every kitchen scrap becomes localized feeding. The cycle never pauses, and resilience grows from continuity. Another thing I didn't anticipate was how this method changed watering habits. Healthier soil holds more moisture. Organic matter acts like a reservoir. As it breaks down, it increases the soil's ability to retain water without becoming waterlogged. That means fewer watering sessions, deeper root growth, and plants that can handle fluctuations better. Instead of reacting to stress, the soil absorbs it. That's the difference between a managed system and a design system. A managed system needs attention to stay functional. A design system gains strength over time. Low input living isn't about doing nothing. It's about setting up patterns that compound instead of degrade. And here's something most people don't realize. Compost piles often accelerate decomposition through heat. That heat breaks material down quickly, but it also burns through carbon faster. In-place decomposition is slower and cooler. It mirrors natural forest floors where organic matter integrates gradually. Slower breakdown means longer-lasting soil improvement. It's less dramatic. There's no steaming pile to admire. No big moment of finished compost satisfaction, just steady improvement. Over a few seasons, I realized something almost uncomfortable. The garden looked less impressive from a distance. There were no tidy bins, no defined compost corner, no obvious productivity ritual. But the soil underneath was healthier, and my time was freer. That trade-off felt worth it. So does this mean compost piles are useless? No, they can be helpful in certain situations. If you're dealing with contaminated material that needs to break down safely, if you're managing waste far from growing areas, if you're in a setting where burying scraps isn't practical, there are contexts where a pile makes sense. But here's the real question. Does it fit your energy? Low input living isn't about copying what works for someone else. It's about removing systems that require constant management and replacing them with patterns that sustain themselves. For me, compost piles became a routine I had to maintain. If I ignored them, they dried out. If I neglected turning them, they compacted. If I forgot ratios, they slowed down. The pile always needed something. When I shifted to in-place feeding, the soil needed less from me. That's the difference. If a system collapses without your attention, it's labor dependent. If a system improves with minimal input, it's design dependent. And that shift changes how you approach everything in a garden. Instead of asking, what chore do I need to complete this week? You start asking, what pattern can I put in place so this solves itself? Leaving roots in the ground becomes automatic. Chopping and dropping becomes instinct. Burying scraps becomes routine. Keeping soil covered becomes default. No separate fertility station, no waiting period. No extra hauling, just return. There's something quietly powerful about shortening the loop between growth and decay. Food grows, remnants return. Soil improves, food grows again. Nothing leaves unless it absolutely has to. And when export decreases, input requirements shrink. That's the core of this idea. You don't build soil by processing it in a distant pile. You build soil by never interrupting the cycle in the first place. The longer I practiced this, the more I noticed how much of gardening culture is built around visible effort. Big compost piles, tilt beds, clean edges, defined zones. But natural systems are messier and far more efficient. The question becomes simple. Are you gardening to look productive? Or are you gardening to reduce long-term effort? For me, the answer changed everything. I stopped chasing finished compost and started building continuous fertility. I stopped managing piles and started protecting soil. And over time, the garden required less intervention, not more. If this way of thinking resonates with you, if you're tired of adding more tasks to an already full schedule, that's exactly why low-input living exists. Not to abandon responsibility, but to design systems that don't depend on constant supervision. If you found this helpful, stay with the channel. We're going deeper into soil, water, perennials, and the small design shifts that quietly remove work from your life. Because the goal isn't bigger piles, it's lighter effort and better soil.